Some people think loneliness only comes from being physically alone. But I think there's another kind of loneliness that many cycle breakers carry before they ever create distance from anyone. The loneliness of being surrounded by people who know your story but never fully acknowledge your pain. Of sitting in family gatherings pretending everything feels normal while your body is holding tension the entire time. Realizing you've spent years emotionally translating, minimizing, over-explaining, and shrinking yourself just to maintain connection. When you grow up inside dysfunction, belonging often comes with conditions. Don't speak about what happened. Don't make people uncomfortable or ruin the family image. Don't create distance or change in ways that force other people to confront themselves. And for a long time, many of us learn to survive by adapting to those unspoken rules. Sometimes those survival skills become so normalized that we don't realize how disconnected we've become from ourselves in the process. I think part of what makes becoming a cycle breaker so emotionally complicated is choosing healing is about recognizing how much of your identity was built around surviving, the roles you carried, and the silence that you had to maintain. The ways you abandoned yourself trying to preserve relationships that slowly drained you emotionally. Eventually, something inside you begins changing. Maybe it's a moment where your body feels exhausted after having another conversation that leaves you dysregulated. Or maybe it's a family gathering where you suddenly realized how much tension you've normalized for years. Where you recognize that protecting everyone else's comfort has come at the expense of your own peace. And once you begin seeing those patterns clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee them. This is Born Tired, where survival meets healing, a podcast for those of us who grew up in survival mode but are ready to heal and speak our truth. I'm Irene, a cycle breaker learning what peace feels like after years of survival. Every episode is an invitation inside your truth, to feel seen and to remember you are never alone. This is what it sounds like when silence finally breaks. Before we begin, I want to share a gentle reminder. Please listen in a way that feels safe for you. If at any point you need to pause or step away, honor that. Your well-being matters more than finishing the episode. You are not alone. Take care of yourself while you listen. I think many cycle breakers spend a long time trying to find the middle ground, trying to hold on to family while also protecting themselves emotionally, keeping one foot inside their old life while slowly building a new one. But eventually you realize healing asks something painful from you. Honesty about what happened. Acceptance that certain relationships affect your nervous system. Being real with yourself. And accepting the fact that some environments no longer feel emotionally safe. That honesty can change everything. Because once you stop participating in the silence, family systems often react. Some people minimize or avoid conversations completely. Others stay neutral because acknowledging the truth would force them to confront things within themselves too. And sometimes the people who caused the harm continue receiving support, protection, community, while the person carrying the emotional aftermath becomes isolated. I don't think people talk enough about how painful that part is. To watch yourself become the uncomfortable truth people would rather avoid. And yet, even through all that loneliness, many cycle breakers still continue to choose healing. Because at some point, the pain of abandoning yourself becomes heavier than the pain of disappointing other people. And I think that's the crossroads many survivors eventually reach. The moment where you realize you can continue sacrificing your peace in order to maintain connection. Where you begin understanding that healing may feel lonely sometimes, but there's also loneliness in constantly betraying yourself just to belong. For me, one of the hardest parts about becoming a cycle breaker has been realizing that healing changes every relationship around you. Not only the relationships with the people who hurt you directly, but the entire emotional world connected to them. Siblings, cousins, extended family, traditions and memories. The people who made up so much of your life for so long. And I think that's what makes this kind of grief so difficult to explain. Because there can still be love there. history and good memories mixed in with the painful ones. It's rarely as simple as people imagine it to be. I didn't want distance. I wanted honesty, accountability, and safety. I wanted the truth to matter. But I also had to accept that some family systems depend on silence to survive. And once you stop participating in that silence, everything changes. Some losses happen dramatically. Others happen without me even noticing. A cousin slowly stops reaching out. Conversations become surface level. You can feel people becoming careful around you. Family gatherings continue without you. People hear pieces of your story and decide it's easier to stay neutral than confront what actually happened. And I think one of the most painful things survivors hear is there's two sides to every story. Because abuse isn't a disagreement. It's not simply two people seeing things differently. There's a difference between conflict and harm, between accountability and surviving environments that damaged your nervous system, your sense of self, and your ability to feel emotionally safe. Sometimes the people saying those things witnessed enough to know better. I think a lot of family members convince themselves neutrality is kindness. But when abuse is involved, neutrality often protects the system more than the person who was harmed. That realization changed the way I saw a lot of relationships. I also started noticing another kind of distance. The people who slowly avoid you because when they look at you, all they see is the trauma attached to you. Almost like your existence reminds them of things that they would rather not confront. And I don't even think it comes from cruelty. Sometimes people avoid cycle breakers because we disrupt the version of the family story they've learned to survive inside of. Our honesty forces them closer to their own pain, memories, and denial. And not everyone is ready for that. I think some people distance themselves because acknowledging your experience would mean having to acknowledge parts of themselves too. So instead, they avoid, disconnect, keep conversations shallow, and interact from a distance. And over time, you start realizing some people are uncomfortable with you because of what your healing forces them to feel. I also know part of my loneliness came from the choices I made to survive. I moved away, created distance. I stopped going to family functions, even when I was invited, because the fear of running into certain people would completely dysregulate me before I even walked into the room. My body would tense up days beforehand. And then there's the anxiety, hypervigilance, and emotional exhaustion afterwards. I knew what those environments did to my nervous system. And I think people who haven't experienced that sometimes misunderstand it. They see the distance as rejection, when for many survivors, it's protection. At first, the invitations still come. People still ask. There's still a thread connecting you to your old life. But eventually, after enough distance, people stop inviting you. And even when you understand why, it still hurts. Because there's grief in realizing survival could cost you belonging and community. I think that's the impossible feeling many cycle breakers carry. Wanting both at the same time. You want your healing, you want your family, you want your truth to be known, but you also want sense of connection with people. Eventually, though, you realize you can't step fully into a new life while emotionally keeping one foot in the old one. At some point, you have to decide. And I don't think many people talk enough about how heartbreaking that decision can feel. Because choosing yourself can still feel like loss, guilt, and exile. It feels like you're grieving people who are still alive. There are moments where I felt deeply alone because healing changed me too. I started noticing things I used to normalize, dynamics I used to excuse, relationships built around guilt, silence, obligation, or the roles I had been carrying for years. The strong and understanding one who absorbs everything quietly so everyone else can stay comfortable. And once you stop playing those roles, relationships change with it. I think that realization makes you grieve the person you used to be. The version of yourself that spent years overextending, over-explaining, trying to earn love through self-abandonment. There's grief in realizing how much of your life was spent surviving. But underneath all that loneliness, I think something else slowly begins to happen. You start recognizing the difference between being alone and being unsafe. You begin hearing your own voice more clearly, feeling your own boundaries, and trusting your reality without needing everyone else to validate it first. And I will say, even though I still grieve, I also know I can't return to that version of myself that required silence in order to belong. Because eventually you realize the loneliness of healing hurts, but not as much as abandoning yourself over and over just to keep connection. I think one of the hardest things about being a cycle breaker is accepting that healing won't always feel hopeful while you're inside of it. Sometimes healing feels like grief before it feels like peace. When you begin separating yourself from unhealthy family dynamics, you're not only grieving the people involved, you're grieving the emotional world you spent your entire life attached to. The familiar chaos, the version of yourself that existed inside those relationships. And I think that's why loneliness becomes such a central part of the experience for many survivors. Because growth changes what your nervous system can tolerate. There comes a point where your body starts recognizing things your mind spent years trying to rationalize away. Conversations that leave you emotionally drained. Environments that make your chest tighten before you even walk into the room. And once you become aware of that, it becomes difficult to return to pretending everything feels normal. I think many cycle breakers spend years trying to hold on to family while also protecting themselves, trying to maintain connection without fully abandoning your truth. But the thing is, dysfunctional systems ask survivors to participate in their own silence in order to remain included. That's the painful part people don't always understand. And eventually survivors reach a point where they have to ask themselves a heartbreaking question. How much of myself am I willing to lose just to maintain connection? I think many of us stayed emotionally attached far longer than people realize, because family bonds run deep, even when they're unhealthy, especially for people raised to prioritize loyalty, caretaking, or keeping the family together at all costs. There's another kind of grief that comes from realizing some people will never fully acknowledge the harm, because acknowledging it would change how they see themselves too. There's also pain in watching the person who caused the harm continue to receive support, protection, community, while you're left carrying the emotional aftermath of what happened. I don't think people talk enough about how disorienting that feels. To watch people gather around someone who hurt you. To see your family continue celebrating them, defending them, including them, while you slowly become the uncomfortable person people avoid discussing. And sometimes survivors aren't only grieving the abuse itself, but the realization that telling the truth can cost you belonging, while harming others doesn't. That kind of loneliness cuts deeply because it can make you feel invisible in your own story, especially when the people around you prioritize keeping the family emotionally comfortable over acknowledging what actually happened. And I think cycle breakers become reminders inside families of what happened, what was ignored, normalized, and what nobody wanted to say out loud. That can make relationships feel incredibly complicated because you begin realizing some people only knew how to connect with the survival version of you, the version that tolerated everything and stayed quiet, who overextended emotionally, the version that absorbed tension to keep everyone else comfortable. I think many survivors grieve how quickly people become uncomfortable once you stop carrying pain silently, especially when you begin setting boundaries that prioritize your nervous system instead of everyone else's comfort. For me, distance became part of survival. I moved away physically, but also emotionally. I stopped attending family gatherings because I knew what certain environments did to my body. The feeling of shrinking back into old versions of myself just to get through an interaction. I think survivors often carry guilt for the isolation, even when the isolation was necessary. But needing distance from people who dysregulate your nervous system isn't selfishness. I think healing eventually forces survivors to stop measuring love by proximity alone. Because sometimes people love you and still can't love you in healthy ways. They can care about you while also contributing to the environments that harm you emotionally. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is accept reality. Instead of constantly hoping people will become who you needed them to be. That acceptance can hurt, but it also leads you to finally stop abandoning yourself. And I think that's why the loneliness of cycle breaking feels so profound sometimes. You aren't only losing relationships, you're losing identities, old coping mechanisms, and entire emotional patterns that once shaped your life. But I also think something begins happening underneath all the grief. You begin learning what safety and peace feels like, what relationships feel like when they aren't built entirely around survival. And little by little, loneliness starts transforming into something else. Space to breathe differently, to exist without constant emotional tension, and build a life that no longer revolves around surviving dysfunction. I think that's one of the truths about healing. Sometimes the loneliness is not evidence that you made the wrong decision. It's evidence that you finally stopped abandoning yourself long enough to begin becoming who you were underneath survival all along. I think one of the most important things I want people to understand is that loneliness during healing doesn't mean you're failing or that you made the wrong decision. It doesn't mean you're unlovable. Sometimes it simply means your life is changing faster than your sense of belonging can catch up to. I think many cycle breakers end up in this strange emotional space where your old life no longer fits, but the new life hasn't fully formed yet. And that in-between season can feel incredibly quiet, especially after spending years surrounded by emotional intensity, chaos, or relationships that consumed so much of your mental energy. When the noise disappears, the silence feels unsettling at first. But that silence is the first place your nervous system finally gets to rest. And I think survivors deserve to hear that healing isn't only about what you lose. It's also about what slowly becomes possible afterward. Because when you stop spending your life emotionally managing dysfunction, something unexpected begins to happen. You begin having more room for yourself, your thoughts, your body softens, and your emotions stop revolving entirely around survival. You begin noticing small moments of peace that once felt impossible to reach. I also think there's something powerful about surviving environments that taught you to abandon yourself and still deciding to build a softer life anyway. A more honest and peaceful one. A life where your nervous system no longer has to earn safety through silence. I think many cycle breakers underestimate how much strength it takes to choose that path repeatedly, especially when loneliness makes you question yourself. When you watch other people stay connected to family systems that you had to step away from. When the people who harmed you continue receiving support while you carry the emotional consequences in private. That kind of pain can make you wonder if telling the truth was worth it. But I think deep down, most survivors know what returning would cost them. Because once you begin reconnecting yourself, truly reconnecting, you realize how exhausting it was living disconnected from your own reality for so long. Eventually, you realize that peace isn't something small. It changes your health, your sleep, your relationships, the way you parent, how you speak to yourself internally, how your body exists in the world. Many cycle breakers aren't only healing for themselves. They're changing what safety looks like for the people who come after them too. And even if the work feels lonely sometimes, it matters deeply. I also want people to know that healing doesn't mean becoming cold or emotionally detached. Grief and healing can exist together. You can miss people and still maintain boundaries, love them, and still recognize they're unhealthy for you. That emotional complexity doesn't make your healing less valid. It makes you human. And if you're in that lonely season right now, I hope you remember this. Healing is learning not to run back toward chaos simply because it feels familiar. It's allowing yourself to stay long enough in peace for it to stop feeling uncomfortable. I truly believe many cycle breakers spend so much of their lives surviving that they forget they were always meant to do something more than survive. You're meant to exist fully too, to create, laugh without fear, rest without guilt, build relationships where honesty doesn't threaten connection, and experience love that doesn't require you to disappear inside it. And even if your path feels lonely right now, I don't believe loneliness will be the final destination for everyone who chooses healing. Sometimes healing begins in isolation because isolation creates the space where your real voice can finally be heard underneath everyone else's expectations. And maybe healing is finally trusting yourself enough to stop returning to places that required you to abandon who you are. Before we wrap up, I wanted to let you know that after this episode, I'll be taking a short break from the podcast for a few weeks to spend some time with my family. One of the things I've learned through this journey is that healing is about being present for the life you're building. Right now, I want to make space for that presence. I'll be back soon with new episodes, and I look forward to continuing this journey together when I return. If this episode resonated with you, please share with someone who might need it, and take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen. Your review helps more people find the podcast and reminds others they're not alone. Don't forget to subscribe or follow the show so you never miss an episode. You can also join me on Substack, where I share weekly reflections and gentle reminders to help you feel less alone on your healing journey. You'll find the link in the show notes. If you'd like to connect beyond the podcast, you can find me on Instagram or TikTok at Born Tired Podcast. I'd love to hear what resonated with you. And if you'd like to support the podcast, there's a link there to buy me a coffee. Thank you for being here, for listening with an open heart. Most of all, remember this: your story matters, your voice matters, and you are not alone. This episode was written and narrated by Irene Torres. Audio production by Carlos Torres. Original music composed by Carlos Torres.